Hello everyone. I'm Joyce Klein, the Director of the Field Program at the Aspen Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today on the client outcomes from the Asset Building Through Credit pilot, or as we also refer to it, the ABC pilot. We're glad that you could join us today for what we hope will be an interesting conversation on the lessons from this pilot. So as I mentioned, I'm Joyce Klein. I'm the Director of Field at the Aspen Institute, and my co-moderator and presenter for today's call is my colleague Luz Gomez, who's a consultant with Field, and Luz was a key member of our team that conducted the evaluation of the Asset Building Through Credit pilot. And we also want to thank the organizations that made this work possible. So first, thank you to the Citi Foundation, which provided the financial support for the Asset Building Through Credit pilot. Daria Sheehan, who's a Senior Program Officer with the Foundation, is our Program Officer for the pilot. And she's joined us today, and I'd like to welcome her and invite her to share some thoughts about how this pilot fits into the Citi Foundation's broader work around financial capability and asset building. So Daria?
Thanks, Joyce, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you've joined us for today's webinar on the ABC pilot program. You know, for the past several years, the Citi Foundation's financial capability and asset building portfolio has invested in organizations that are testing innovative program models that improve the financial health of low and moderate income individuals. An important component of our innovation strategy is a commitment to share the lessons learned with practitioners in the field and other key stakeholders so that we promote greater adoption of successful strategies. Aspen Institute's field program is well known for evaluating new ideas and disseminating best practices in microenterprise. For both current and aspiring business owners, access to credit is an important tool to help smooth gaps in cash flow or take advantage of a business opportunity. And although many microenterprise development organizations have used a variety of approaches over the years to help their clients build credit, Field's research showed that offering a revolving line of credit, such as a secured credit card, was not that common within the industry.
Sounds like we may have lost Daria, at least in terms of the audio. So I'm going to just jump in, and maybe we can come back to Daria if she's able to join us. But I just want to thank Daria again for Citi's support and her support for the pilot, and we deeply appreciate that work. Jackie, I just want to do a check. Luz, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't all of us who were disconnected. So let me move on. I want to also thank some of our other key partners in the pilot. One of those is Justine Peterson, which is an asset building organization based in St. Louis. And for those of you who don't know the organization, Justine Peterson has been an early leader in credit building, playing a key role in partnering also with the Credit Builders Alliance. And the ABC pilot was in fact an effort to replicate work that Justine Peterson had done to develop a partnership and a practice around delivering a secured card as a credit building tool. And so Justine Peterson played a critical role with us in working with the pilot sites to build and support their capacities to deliver a secured credit card. And Justine Peterson also managed the online platform that was used to process the secured card applications. And I just want to recognize that joining us virtually today is Kristen Schell, who's Director of the Credit Building Program at Justine Peterson. And Kristen was a key part of the project team, and she has joined us today. You won't hear her speaking, but she is going to help us answer some of the questions that are available, that come in through the chat. So thank you very much to Kristen. And then the other thing I want to do is thank our pilot sites, and they're listed here on the slide. The Mission Economic Development Agency in San Francisco, the Pacific Asian Consortium for Employment in LA, the Latino Economic Development Center in Washington, D.C., the Champlain Valley Office for Economic Opportunity and Central Vermont Community Action in Vermont, and the Local Development Corporation of East New York. And all of those organizations were our pilot sites, and they worked very hard serving clients and collecting data through the course of the pilot, and have been very generous in sharing their knowledge and their work throughout the entire process. So just briefly, let me give you a sense of, again, of the hour today. We're going to first give you a brief amount of context and background for the pilot, give you a snapshot of our research questions and the design for the pilot and the evaluation. And that intro is going to be pretty brief so that we can get to the meat of our findings. As I mentioned earlier, this is the second webinar we've done on the pilot findings. And for those of you who may have joined us for the first one, we didn't want to be too redundant. So if you'd like more information around the pilot design than we provide during today's webinar, please check out the recording from our first webinar and some of our earlier, some of the publications that are on our website. What we really want to do today is focus on what's new and the data that we have to share on the outcomes that were experienced by the pilot participants in terms of changes in their credit score and the extent to which they were able to build strong financial behaviors with the secured card. And we want to talk a little bit about the implications of the findings and the data findings for coaches and nonprofits that are hoping to offer a secured card. And these are implications that we think will have resonance more broadly as organizations think about ways to improve the financial capability of their clients. Then, as I mentioned, hopefully we'll have about 20 minutes to respond to questions and comments, and at the end we'll share information about the next installment of findings, the third installment of findings from the pilot, which is going to focus on the business model for delivering a secured card. And we'll be sending out links to a paper and a series of video casts around that work in the next few coming weeks. So before we start to present the findings, we wanted to get a little bit of a sense of who's joined us today on the call. So we'd like to get a sense of who you are, what kind of organizations you belong to, and a sense of your work or interest in offering credit building products and services. So we ask you to pick one of these, the one that best gives a sense of why you've joined us today. If you're a practitioner, if you're a funder, and if you're a financial institution, and also let us know whether you're offering a credit building service or interested in providing credit building services. And if none of those apply and you're interested for some other reason, you can also select that box. So I think about half the folks have responded, so I'm going to give it another minute. And then we'll go ahead and I'll let you know what the profile of participants looks like. And then we'll dive in. Great. So it looks like just about everyone has responded. If you haven't yet, please go ahead and share your response. But it looks like we have a large number of we have a good chunk of practitioners on the field, also a number of folks who represent financial institutions, and a handful of funders as well. Interestingly, a good number of you already offer credit building services, so I think you'll be interested to hear what we've been able to find in terms of some of the very detailed quantitative outcomes for the folks who we served with a secured credit card. And a number of you are interested in credit building, and hopefully you'll learn a bunch from our conversation today as well. So thank you for giving us that profile. So let me briefly talk a little bit about the design for the Asset Building Through Credit pilot. Its purpose was to really assess whether a secured credit card teamed with targeted financial coaching and education could help entrepreneurs to build their credit and build their business. And what we were really trying to figure out is whether access to the secured card teamed with the coaching could be used to help individuals create or support positive credit building behaviors, whether those behaviors would then result in increases to their actual credit scores, and whether those improved credit scores could ultimately assist clients to progress towards their business development goals by helping them to access financing or to be able to achieve access some of the other benefits of an improved credit score. And so what the pilot did was to test a methodology that helped nonprofits to deliver a secured card to their clients and to coach them successfully in the use of that secured card. And what we're going to do today is focus on the changes in credit scores and the evidence that we saw of positive credit behaviors. And this is data that we collected by tracking the results of for those clients over time. And you can download the complete study from our website, which also discusses the last piece, which is the progress that folks made toward their business goals in greater depth as well. So the design for the evaluation pilot reflects an approach that's been core to Field's work since we were created, which we and others call participatory research or evaluation. And what we mean by participatory is that the evaluation actively involves the organizations who are involved in a particular activity or program. And the purpose of the evaluation is really to help them and others learn and improve their work and their practice. And so we also sometimes call this practitioner-focused evaluation. And it's certainly not the only type of evaluation that has worth, but it's a type of evaluation that has real value, especially when organizations are engaged in a pilot or developing a new program or practice. And one hallmark of this evaluation is that it involves more than one evaluation technique. So in the case of the ABC pilot, we used 3 different evaluation elements. We collected quantitative data on the characteristics of clients when they first came to the program and received the secured card, and on the outcomes that they achieved over time, so that we could really understand where clients were when they came in and then how they progressed over time in terms of their credit behaviors, scores, and business goals. We also conducted site visits to each of the pilot sites to meet directly with the leadership staff and clients who were engaged in the pilot to learn about their experiences and their perceptions. And finally, we also collected data on the way that the counselors and the staff at the pilot sites used their time and the costs associated with implementing the pilot, which allowed us to do a cost analysis that was really valuable. So today we're going to focus on the findings of the outcomes for entrepreneurs who participated in the pilot, and these findings are largely drawn from the quantitative data that we collected on client outcomes. And just to get a little technical on you here, members of our team analyzed the data using multivariate regression of simultaneous equations and correlation analysis. However, we also complemented that quantitative analysis with insights from the clients and participants who we interviewed as part of the evaluation. And their individual stories and experiences were really helpful in contextualizing the quantitative data and allowing us to ask deeper questions as we were analyzing that qualitative data. A little bit about the product, just so you have a baseline of understanding. In the case of the pilot, we teamed credit education and coaching with access to a secured credit card. And just so folks know, a secured credit card is a credit card that's secured with a deposit in a savings account. So sometimes secured cards are fully secured, meaning that the credit limit is equal to the amount of the deposit. And sometimes they're partially secured, which means that the credit line can be larger than the amount of the deposit. And typically the customer can use the card like any credit card, but the charges on the card are secured by the funds in the savings account. And often secured cards are a turn-down product rather than something a financial institution will market directly. In other words, they offer the card to individuals who apply for an unsecured card but are denied approval for that card. And just so folks know, the card used in the pilot was a fully secured card with a minimum balance of $300. So it required at least $300 be put into the savings account for the card. And most of the clients were counseled to start with a card at the minimum size. So that's the basic background. And now I'm going to turn it over to Luz to begin to dive into the quantitative data. So Luz?
Great. Thanks, Joyce. So the profile of the clients who were identified as good targets for the secured card and who ultimately applied for the cards fell largely in 2 categories, and you see them here. So the first were those with no scores or that were new to credit. And this was about 1/3 of participants. Many, but certainly not all of them, were new immigrants and were just beginning to establish credit. And a larger group, so about 2/3 of participants, was the second group of folks that who were looking to rebuild their credit. So generally speaking, the second group was comprised largely of clients who didn't have recent or currently active lines of credit. So those, for example, that were in the midst of a foreclosure proceeding or that had recently gone through a bankruptcy weren't a good match for the card. So here's some additional defining characteristics of the 385 participants who received the secured card. And remember that this pilot was focused on micro-entrepreneurs, so either those with existing businesses or those who are working towards launching their own business. And you can see here that 42% were at the pre-business stage. A substantial number of the participants were minorities, with larger groups being Latino or African American at 45% and 29%. And while the pilot did serve some rural-based entrepreneurs through a site in Vermont, most participants really hailed from urban areas. And then finally, the average and the median household income households were small. There were about 2 members. And the household incomes were modest, a little over $31,000 average and $26,000 median, or 150 to 200% of the federal poverty level. All right, so let's first look at longitudinal changes to scores. So what you see here is a breakdown by percentage changes to credit scores 12 months after participants receive the card. So this first cut shows the direction of change in their scores. So among the 223 clients for whom we had data when they applied to the program and then 12 months later, 71% saw their scores increase. 25% saw their score decrease, and 4% saw no change in their score at 12 months. Now, those percentages include clients who did not have credit scores when they received the card and those who started with a low score. And in many ways, it's actually better to look individually at each group to separate those who came in without a score with those who came in with a low score. So among those with no scores at intake, we saw a more dramatic improvement. So 92% had a score at month 12. All right, so those figures give you a sense of the direction of changes to credit score for all participants. Now let's go a little deeper to see by how much their credit scores actually improved. So here we first show data for those that had a score when they applied for the card. These results show the score changes, looking first at everyone with an existing score, and then below it for those who came in with a score and were able to increase their score, which was about 60% of cardholders who started with a score. Now, the entire group of clients who had a credit score at intake increased their score by a mean of 13 points and a median increase of 12. And as we just saw, there were a number of clients whose scores decreased. So this brings down the average and the median changes for this group. So if we look specifically at the almost 2/3 of clients who came in with a credit score and then were able to increase their score, you see a much more substantial increase. So you have a mean score change of 48 points and a median of 40 points. So clearly it's more challenging to rebuild credit as the score changes are less dramatic than those for those clients that don't have a credit score when they receive the card. All right, so we just saw the changes in scores. Now let's look at the actual scores at 12 months. So what we see is that the clients who came in without a score not only were more likely to improve their scores, but they also had the highest scores as a group. So at 12 months, their average and their median credit scores were 665 and 677, so they did very well. And then among all clients who had a credit score when they applied for the card, which again was roughly 2/3 of the people who had the card, the scores were 598 average and a 597 median at 12 months. And then again, within that group of folks who started with a low score, when we single out those who were able to increase their score, the mean and the median credit score at 12 months was 632 and 633. And now that compares to an average FICO score for that group of 584 when they first took the card. Now we're also interested to understand the percentage of people who are able to move from a subprime credit score, so those with credit scores below 620 points, and to move into a prime category of over 620 and 680. And so we saw that after 12 months, 42% of pilot participants were able to do so. So then we asked, how important are these types of changes in scores? And so to contextualize the outcomes we were seeing, we looked at some additional studies. So moving into prime categories has pretty significant consequences in terms of having access to credit to build a business, and whether that credit is affordably priced. So 2 studies on micro-business owners that we looked at. One was conducted by AEO, the Association for Enterprise Opportunity, and another by CFED. And those studies show that minority and low-income business owners have more difficulty borrowing, and that they're more likely to be denied credit. And so many of these same businesses are declined due to low credit scores. So these statistics are pretty glaring, pretty sobering, and you can see some of them here, some of the details here. So given the challenges faced by these entrepreneurs, and you saw in the beginning the demographic and financial profile of the individuals who participated in this pilot, So the score increases that we just saw and that were achieved by pilot participants could really represent a pretty substantial asset for advancing their businesses. So we would say that, we say these findings are encouraging to both the programs that were involved in the pilot as well as those interested in adding a financial tool like this to their line of products. All right, so we're going to switch gears and go to look at some of the behavior changes that we looked at. Joyce?
Great. So thanks, Luz. And we've had a couple of questions come in for folks wanting to understand why we saw some scores decreasing. And so this conversation about the behaviors that we were looking for and how they translate into scores, I think will begin to answer that question. So, and for others who haven't sent questions, please continue to send them. We're beginning to get some in, and we'd love to be able to answer your questions as we go through this. So in terms of the question of behavior, coming back again to the purpose of the pilot, which was to help clients to build credit and build financial capability, and again, to do that by teaming a secured card with credit education and access to coaching. Let's begin by first defining what we mean by financial capability. So it's more than about just helping clients to gain or retain knowledge about finances. It's very much about building behaviors and enabling individuals to put that knowledge, in fact, into practice. And so one of the ways to build financial capability is to team services or activities that increase financial knowledge with access to a financial product that individuals can use to practice and reinforce key behaviors. And so this just gives you a sense, the slide here, about what we mean by this term for financial capability. So what we were trying to do through the pilot was to build upon three behaviors that the pilot was seeking to develop. And these behaviors are tied to the three golden rules of building credit through use of a revolving line. And here we want to really give credit to the work that's been done by Credit Builders Alliance as well as Justine Peterson in terms of really identifying and sharing knowledge about the factors that go into building credit. And so through their work, they identified that 65% of a FICO score is based on payment history, which has to do with paying on time, and the amounts owed on existing lines of credit, so keeping balances low. And so from that, they identified the three golden rules of building credit and maximizing scores. And you can see those here. They are always making your payments on time, keeping balances on credit lines low, and ideally that's below 30% of the available credit limit, and not using the card to consume, which put another way is to use the card only to pay for items that the individual would already have purchased anyway with cash, not to purchase new items or to increase their spending in a given month. So the coaching process that accompanied delivery of the secured card really focused on messaging and building these three core behaviors. And the training that we did for counselors at the pilot sites at the start of the behavior, which was done by the team at Justine Peterson, really focused on how coaches could communicate and message these three behaviors. And so then what we did in our evaluation was we sought to measure how the secured cardholders did in terms of adhering to these financial behaviors. And this was in addition to looking at the credit scores of the cardholders. So how did we do this? What we did in the evaluation is that at the beginning, when folks first came in to apply for the secured card, the counselors pulled their credit and they did an analysis of the individual's credit with them, and they determined whether a secured card, first of all, could be a good tool for that individual to help them build their credit given their profile. But if the individual applied for and received a secured card, then counselors checked in with clients at least 3 times, and in some cases more, after they received the secured card. And as part of the evaluation, we asked the coaches or the pilot sites to check in at 3, 6, and 12 months. And at those check-ins, they pulled the cardholders' credit reports, and they collected and sent to us data on whether the individuals were making their payments on time, whether their balances were above or below 30% of their credit limit. And they sent us some other data as well, including look at how well clients were managing other debt that they might have, other credit lines over that 12-year period. So the check-ins were used to collect data. Importantly, they were also used to reinforce messages to the clients about adhering to these 3 golden rules. So here's what we saw in terms of credit behaviors, and this begins to inform what we saw in terms of movements to scores. We saw that the majority of cardholders paid their cards on time. At 12 months, basically 80% of them had been regularly paying making payments on their secured card on time. However, as a group, they had a harder time keeping their balances on the card low. So at 12 months, only 19% of them had consistently kept their balances below 30% of the credit limit. And to understand why the cardholders were challenged to maintain to that credit building rule, this is where it was helpful for us to interview actual participants to get an understanding of why they did not keep to this behavior of keeping low balances and so therefore didn't maximize the credit building potential of the card. And just to give you a flavor of what we heard from folks, one client, for example, regularly used the entire line of credit to buy inventory at his business. And he found that by having access to the line of credit, he could buy in bulk, he could get discounts on his inventory purchases, and he could increase his profitability. So for him, that was a trade-off that he wanted to make. In another case, we interviewed a client who had a family emergency to attend to. She had an aunt who was very ill in another state, and she used a secured card to buy a plane ticket. Prior to having the secured card, she wouldn't have been able to visit her aunt because she wouldn't have been able to have a ticket to buy, have a secured card or a credit card to be able to purchase a ticket online. So again, she made a choice to be able to use the card in that way. And so, we know to some extent it was difficult for folks to maintain low balances because for many of them the overall credit limit was small. On average, if their credit line was $300, they had to keep their charges below $90 in order to maintain to that 30% rule. But it could also be that in some cases clients made choices based on the opportunities or challenges that they were facing in their life, and if this was their only source of credit, they made a choice to use the credit card that way. The one other thing I wanted to share is we did see some other good outcomes at the 12-month period. We saw that clients had increased their access to credit. So they went to having an average of 2.8 trade lines versus 1 at baseline. And this was important because individuals really need to get to 3 lines of credit to be considered sort of beyond being a thin file. And the second thing is we also saw lower debt loads. So the debt to income ratio among the pilot participants declined to 17% from 27% at baseline. So again, generally speaking, these represented some good behavioral changes and good behaviors among clients that programs can build on to reinforce the positive use of financial products going forward. So now I'm going to turn it back to Luz to add a few more findings for us.
Great. So let's go back to the topic of credit score distribution of the pilot participants. So you'll remember that 42% of clients moved from subprime scores to prime scores by 12 months. And a sizable portion of those that achieved a prime score were those that didn't have a score at intake. But we wanted to dig in a bit further among the other groups, so those who started with a low score and didn't move out of the subprime category. And you'll see here that 69% of those who started in this low score category remain there after 12 months. And so to try to understand what happened with that group of folks, we compared those who improved their scores to those who didn't. And what we found was that the folks who improved their scores had better payment behaviors. In particular, making timely payments had a significant impact on the outcomes of this group, which isn't surprising. But we also saw that the household incomes were higher in that group that were successful in raising their score. So getting back to trying to contextualize the data, this really dovetails with that study that we noted a minute ago from CFED. And that study showed that lower income micro businesses are more financially vulnerable and that they often have tenuous cash flows and less savings to fall back on in the face of financial emergencies. And you just heard a couple examples from Joyce which touched on some of those. So it would make sense that this group would have more trouble making on-time payments should a financial difficulty or an unexpected expense arise. And we'll talk a little bit more about some implications for providers of these products in just a minute. All right, so this next key question that we looked at was whether the number of hours of education provided mattered in terms of client outcomes. And I want to emphasize here that this study didn't look at whether the education or the absence of education mattered to the outcomes, and we couldn't answer that question. because all the groups within our pilot offered some level, differing levels of financial education and coaching. On average, among all the groups, they offered 12.4 hours of credit education and coaching per client over a year's time. But what we did find was that more hours of education didn't necessarily bring about better outcomes in terms of higher credit scores or more positive payment behaviors. So it would be useful to further study this question with a control group to see if that still holds over a long term. But this was an interesting finding for us when thinking about the sustainability of offering the product. And as Joyce noted at the beginning, we'll talk more about this in our business model publication that will be out in a couple weeks. But basically, pilot programs might want to carefully consider the number of hours dedicated to education as they seek to balance, to strike this balance between client outcomes from this type of program with the organization's need for efficiency and sustainability. We saw in our first publication that staff cost was the greatest expense for all the pilot programs. And so again, this doesn't mean that credit education and coaching doesn't make a difference in terms of generating strong credit outcomes. It just means that we didn't find that clients who received a greater number of hours of education, that they did better. Okay, so let's move on into looking at what are some implications of these key findings for providers. And we think there are three important areas to consider. So the first is understanding the specific profile of your clients. So is the population you're working with primarily thin file, or do they largely have low existing scores? Key question. Another is, what's the financial position of the client you're serving? Are they lower income? Are they more moderate income? And as we just saw, those with the more challenging financial positions could have more difficulty in building credit. So in our paper, we reference a couple of examples of savings mechanisms that could be used in tandem or perhaps prior to the introduction of the secured card, and that could really help to build a savings buffer for clients to ensure that on-time payments are always made, and so they really maximize the credit building abilities of the card. All right, so the first point. Second point to consider is to allocate coaching time according to the profile of your customer. So as we just mentioned, staff time dedicated to the education and coaching was the biggest expense, the greatest expense for the pilot programs. And again, given the outcomes of the behaviors of different client profiles, so those with existing scores may need more intensive guidance, especially in the first 6 months of using the card versus those that had thin or no files. And then third, as we saw a few slides back on the financial behaviors, a positive finding was that pilot participants had on average 2.8 trade lines after 12 months. So again, this put them at that threshold of moving beyond a thin credit file. The tricky part of that is that once clients start building credit, the credit offers start arriving in the mail. And we heard that a lot from our pilot program managers. So programs during the pilot began developing content and sharing it amongst each other that focused on comparing prices and costs for unsecured credit cards and evaluating product attributes, different product attributes of a different card. And that information is more likely to stick as the programs delivered it at a really critical moment of graduation from the secured card at that 12-month period, or right before the 12-month period. So I think the main takeaway is that it's really critically important to take stock of the clients that you have, to really understand who they are from a financial and credit profile, so that programs can really craft a process that will help them ensure that clients have the greatest opportunity to use a tool like this to successfully build credit. Okay, so I think that it gives you some main highlights of the study. Again, there's much more depth within the downloadable white paper. But why don't we go ahead and pause for question? I know we have Kristen Schell from Justine Peterson has been responding to some of the questions. But Joyce, if you want to take us through some more?
Sure. So we had a couple of questions around this finding around that relates to the hours and of financial education and coaching that were provided and how that related to the outcomes that we saw. And I just want to repeat a little bit. There are some things we can say from the data, and there are some things that we can't. The way the pilot was designed, it was designed that the secured card would always be accompanied by some form of coaching and or financial education. And we use those terms a little bit interchangeably because we didn't dictate for the organizations to what extent the information that they provided as they worked with clients had to do in a sort of a one-on-one coaching environment, or whether some of it could take place in a group setting, in which case we referred to it more as education. And we really allowed the pilot sites, all of whom were doing some kind of existing work around credit education and credit building, we allowed them to sort of blend the delivery of this product into their existing programs because we wanted it to work for them and them to work toward a model that they could think was sustainable. So because all of the sites offered some form of credit education and coaching along with the card, we couldn't test whether providing that education and coaching made a difference or not, because everyone got some level of financial education and training. What we did track is we tracked the total number of hours that individuals received, although we couldn't really, it was too complicated and difficult to tease out what the optimal blend of hours was for folks. Or whether all of their, how much of the assistance they received was one-on-one versus in a group-based setting. All that we were able to say is, as we looked at when the number of hours of coaching or financial education went up, we didn't see any measurable or statistically significant increase or improvement in their outcomes. Liz, would you add anything else there?
No, I think that's good.
Yeah, that's where an area where we could, as Lou said, where we could use more of a control group methodology or some ability to do some more detailed tracking that might inform that question going forward. So, a second question that we received is, what kind of increase in loan readiness did we see? And again, and pointing out importantly that increased credit score is only one part of loan readiness. So what we were able to see is that, and this gets into this question that we looked at of whether folks were progressing towards their business goals. We were able to see that some clients were able to access financing, in some cases from the microenterprise organization that they were working with as they move forward. Luz, do you remember off the top of your head what % of clients were able to access a loan?
I don't remember off the top of my head. I want to say in the 20% range. I want to say that, but yeah.
Okay, great. So that's a number you can that is in the report findings, and we can try to get back to you on that. We can see your name, so whoever asked that question, so we can get back to you on that. Another question, Luz, we began to get into this. Well, what were the main reasons that scores decreased, and whether it's typical for entrepreneurs receiving financial coaching to have this level of score decreases? So I will say we can talk a little bit about what we know about the main reasons why we saw scores decreasing. But the one piece that I would say is I think it's a little hard for us to say whether entrepreneurs receiving coaching typically have that kind of decrease, because I'm not sure we're familiar with that much other resource that actually gets at the question of what happens to credit scores for folks who get financial coaching. So if other folks know about that, please comment in the box and we can share that information. Luz, do you want to talk a little bit about the question of score decreases? Anything you want to add to that?
We couldn't definitively say, but what we did find is when we compared groups of those that didn't improve versus those that did, one of the main factors, again, that came out was the late payments piece, more so than the lower balance piece. Not to say the lower balance piece isn't important, but this late payment piece really stood out. So this is obviously pretty key to building the score, especially over a short period of 12 months. And I would say that's that was the biggest finding that we had, the strongest finding, I should say.
Okay, great.
And there was a second piece to that score, to that question, was there? Or?
I think we got at both pieces of the question, so
okay,
great. Another question from Pablo is, did we track if at the same time people got a secured credit card, they did extra steps such as paying off existing debt in order to get the score improvement? Luz, do you want to take a shot at that, or would you like me to do that?
Yeah, I mean, what they did at the onset, what we found was that the bulk of the financial coaching, credit coaching, happened at the beginning of the process. So, and an important piece of that was kind of looking at the whole financial picture of that client. So, depending on the individual situation, there could have been recommendations as to, working on problematic areas. But the key was really, and this is what we really honed or really emphasized to the coaches, was that establishing active lines of credit will build credit more quickly. And so they looked at the whole picture, gave recommendations on the whole picture, and that first step was getting the additional active line of credit on their under their belt to start building that score. But it's a long process. That's why they met with them multiple times to be able to kind of track their progress depending on their individual situation. Do you want to add more, Joyce?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would add is obviously there were a set of clients, as Luz mentioned in the beginning, who came in without a score. So for them, that question of taking other steps besides establishing lines of credit that they could use to demonstrate credit behaviors and build a score, they didn't need to take other steps. The other thing I would say is that clearly another piece of what happened in the coaching process that supported the card also looked at dealing with whatever other issues were on the credit report. And in some cases that wasn't so much paying down existing debt as sort of dealing with things like dispute for things that were incorrectly listed on their credit report. So I know that at least one of the pilot sites did a lot of work helping individuals to do things like write dispute letters to deal with other issues on their credit report. But as Luz said, one of the key points here in terms of thinking about credit building was the idea that the way to build a score quickly is by establishing and performing well on active lines of credit. And so that's why the secured card was particularly important. So,
and if I can just add, there's a little bit of psychological oomph that goes with that. They wanted, especially for those that came in with low existing scores, the idea was, to give them some strong coaching in the beginning, get them an active line of credit, get them performing over the first few months well on the card, and to see, because they did soft pull inquiries when they checked in with the client, and for the client to see that improvement. So it's a little bit in terms of the psychology around the financial behavior of using the card as well.
Great. We have another question that asks, does it make sense for clients to be offered a secured card with a larger amount or a larger credit limit knowing that they might use it for business-related expenses? And I think this is a really great question, and it's one that we wrestled with over time. It was possible for folks to, if they could accumulate the savings, to request and be approved for a higher credit line. And we did see some individuals coming in and secure credit and get a credit line that was more like $1,000 or $2,000. And certainly in terms of adhering to that rule of having to keep your balance below 30% of the credit limit, having a higher credit limit makes it easier for folks to be able to sort of use the card in productive ways and still be able to maintain that, to adhere to that rule. I think we really saw some trade-offs in thinking about whether it made sense to have folks be able to access a higher credit limit. One was that we really were trying to help folks build positive behaviors, and for a good chunk of folks, they were rebuilding credit, so they'd had some challenges in the past, and I think part of the goal was to have folks start with something where they couldn't to minimize the amount of the mistakes they could make if they were having challenges not accumulating extra debt. So that was one reason to try to coach folks to try to keep to a smaller credit limit. Another issue just simply has to do with the fact, and one of the issues that related to the size of the credit line was that it was challenging for some folks to even come up with the $300. That was the minimal amount required to achieve the secured card. So that's another challenge, is that the individual had to come up with whatever amount is required to secure that line. I do think, though, that your question and the fact that what we saw in terms of some individuals really really wanting to use the secured card as really a financing tool for their business really does show that many entrepreneurs do need access to a credit card, and they're looking to that not necessarily to build credit, but really to use as a financing mechanism for their business. What we really tried to do in the pilot was to focus on and communicate that what we were really trying to do with the secured card, with this secured card in this pilot, was really use it as a tool for building credit. But that doesn't mean that that's what all the clients saw in it when they came into the program. Luz, would you add anything else there?
No, I think that you made the key point, especially with respect to the savings piece, which was a challenge that we identified pretty early on. And the counselors within the pilot sites are really trying to troubleshoot amongst each other to kind of help especially the lower income clients that they were working with able to get started with the card.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We also had a question, someone wanting to know more detail on the size of the micro businesses in terms of average sales and whether there was any correlation between score changes and growth spurts in the businesses. And I have to say we did not have data on the size of the businesses. We had data on the clients, but less data on their business except to whether they were in business or when they started to come in and when they applied for the secured card, and whether by the time 12 months later they had started a business if they didn't have when they came in. That was for a couple of reasons. One was because there were a number of clients who came in, and one of the really ideal target markets for the card were individuals who were looking to start a business but hadn't yet started it. And for many of them, because they knew that accessing financing to start their business was really important, were very motivated to be able to build credit so they could actually access financing. So for them, we didn't have any data to collect. But the other piece was really trying to create an evaluation that gave us the most important pieces of data but didn't unduly burden either the entrepreneurs or the programs that were part of the pilot. So that just wasn't one of the pieces that we were able to collect through this piece. We have another question that asked how much ongoing financial guidance was provided during card use versus the upfront initial coaching at the time the card was issued. And Luz, we did document that in the first publication that we put out.
Right. The data is a little bit cleaner in the second document, but so again, on average, there was 12.4 hours of education provided per client over a 12-month period. A little over 4 hours was provided, again, on average at the onset of the period. So that would include the initial financial and credit coaching. That would be assistance, perhaps filling out the application and getting them through that piece. So again, about a third of that education was provided up front, and then in increments that we saw in our first publication of a couple of hours at each of those check-ins. So that gives you a flavor for the how much time they spent up front as well as over the 12-month period.
Great. We also had a question about the age range and the percent of pilot participants that were immigrants. Luz, maybe you can work on remembering the numbers around age range. In terms of immigrants, we didn't actually ask about immigrant status. We do know anecdotally that many of the sites that we worked with, a large percentage of their clients were immigrants or recent immigrants, and many of the folks who came in with 0 scores, although not all of them, were immigrants. But we don't have specific numbers on that. We didn't ask folks to identify whether they were immigrants or not.
Right. And we actually didn't collect age range either. That was information provided directly to the secured card provider on their application, but we didn't collect that as part of the evaluation data.
That's right. We collected household income and we collected family size.
Right.
And gender and ethnicity were some of the main things that we wanted to look at. So, okay. We had another question about whether the person can build or have a credit score without having any kind of credit cards. And it is possible to establish credit scores using other kinds of mechanisms. Certainly installment loans as well as credit cards are a piece of that. So it all has to do with the kinds of trade lines that folks have active that are reported to a credit bureau. So. We also had a question about whether we're tracking credit scores and behaviors after the clients graduated from the program. And basically we went up to the point of 12 months after they received the secured card, but that was the last point at which we collected data. That was the point at which we felt we had the resources to be able to do that kind of analysis. We thought that could give us a good picture of how folks were progressing over that period of time. Okay. Luz, one other question about whether we're studying intake and assessment tools that measure potential participant motivation. And there, in terms of the secured card, really the process that was used to analyze and assess whether a client was a good fit for a secured card had to do with looking in depth at their credit report and their credit profile and assessing whether adding an additional active line of credit could be a good tool given their overall sort of credit situation in helping them to improve their score. So for certain individuals, depending on whether they had a very recent bankruptcy or whether they had large amounts of existing active lines on which they were not making on-time payments, for those kinds of individuals, a secured card might not be feasible or might not be something that could really actually help them build their score. So that was really the assessment process that organizations went through, and that's something that Justine Peterson has a lot of experience doing counseling and training around doing those kinds of assessments. The other point that I would say is one of the things we did find in terms of our evaluation, and this is more anecdotally from interacting with coaches, was that we did see that that clients who had a deeper relationship with the microenterprise program beyond just wanting to access a secured card, but were actively receiving other kinds of support from the microenterprise organization in terms of helping to start their business, those were the folks that seemed to do the best with a secured card. So for many organizations it became clear that they didn't necessarily want to market the card as a separate product, but they really wanted to market it as one of the tools that they could help entrepreneurs to access to help them build towards the goal of starting or building a stronger business. So, Luz, do you see other questions we want to tee up here? We have I think time for one or two more.
Right, there was one question that's sort of the holy grail of one of the questions that we wanted to ask. How many hours of coaching was optimal? And we were hoping to find that. As we noted, all the organizations provided differing levels and differing types of credit coaching and financial assistance. But we couldn't, within our analysis, find that number. We couldn't say with certainty that 5 or 6 hours was optimal in terms of providing that support. But I did wanted to use that as a teaser for our next publication as we'll delve a little bit deeper into sort of the business model for sustaining a program like this, because this is a question that organizations wrestled with, given the finding that just because you throw a ton of hours at one at a client doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to come out with better outcomes in terms of credit scores, in terms of payment behavior. So thinking critically in terms of the organization itself around how should they balance the efficiency of their coaching process. And so we hope to have some more information on that topic within that publication that will help illuminate some of these answers. But we couldn't get to that one number that we could share with you all. And it's for folks that love the statistics aspects of it. Within the white paper, we also have an appendix which will show you the statistical tests that we ran for the paper as well.
So terrific. So thank you, Lou. So we do have a couple other questions which we are not all going to get to. So let me close out for folks, and at the very end you will see information to some of your questions about where you can actually find the publications, and also contact information so that if we weren't able to get to some of your questions, you can certainly email those to us, and we can follow up with you individually. So just moving on in terms of what the next steps for us are in terms of sharing information. As Luz mentioned, sort of one of the key issues we tried to understand through the pilot was whether and how a credit building program like this could be sustained over the long term. So as organizations wanted to move from pilot stage, if they found that this was a really good tool for their clients, and several of our pilot participants did, what were the steps they needed to think about in terms of how to build a program that they could sustain over time? So one of the things we did as part of the evaluation is we tracked the hours spent in providing credit building education and training, also the hours spent managing and implementing the program, and we tracked cost data about what it cost the organization, the full costs for them to implement the program during that first year. And we wanted to do that to help the pilot organizations really think through their value proposition, their training processes, their market channels, and their overall revenue and cost model so that they could have data to reflect on as they thought about sustaining this program over time. So what we did is we worked intensively with two of the pilot programs, Meta and PACE, to really identify and analyze their business model for this line of business for offering a secured card team with coaching over the long term. And the last publication that we're going to be releasing as part of our evaluation findings shares some of the key lessons and takeaways from that process that we worked through with those two sites. And we're actually going to be putting out a white paper and also a set of short companion video casks that share some of those experiences. So just in brief, a couple of areas that were particular areas of focus or pain points for the organizations were really about trying to understand in a detailed way what their full costs were of running a program like this. And Lou's referred to the issue of staff costs just a bit ago. And second, really getting to a clear and concise value proposition for the target markets they were looking to serve, and that value proposition being really clear to be able to communicate to donors and other investors the value of investing in this kind of work. So look for those moving forward. We will be sending out e-blasts and other information to let you know when all of those are available. So just in terms of, as Luz mentioned, we have two products that are companions to this webinar. We have the full publication, the full white paper or analysis that presents the research findings on client outcomes, and we also have a brief infographic that are available. And you can download those from our website. And if we go to the next slide, folks will have a few minutes to jot down our email address and our website, the link to the publications. We'll also email out, as I mentioned, links to the publications and to the webinar and the PowerPoint as well. So more from us on this, and please share with us your questions and reactions. I guess one final thing is I'd like to again thank the Citi Foundation, and Derry, I think you're back with us now, so if you had any other closing remarks you wanted to make.
Joyce, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Terrific.
Great. Sorry for the technical difficulties before. For some reason, the phone I was on just cut out on us. But I just wanted to say thank you to the team at Aspen, as well as Justine Peterson and the 6 micro enterprise organizations that were part of this demonstration project. They put in a tremendous amount of time and expertise in getting to this point and working through how to really offer this secured card to clients in the most effective way. And we really appreciate all of their efforts, not only to make it successful, but to share the learnings. And this webinar is part of that, but also I encourage you to look at the white paper because there's a lot more detailed information in there that I think can be useful. And our goal is always to have others in the field take up successful practices, and I think this is one that holds a lot of promise for the millions of Americans with thin and no credit files. So I just want to thank everyone for coming on the call today and for the team that worked so diligently on this demonstration project. Thank you.
Thanks, Daria. It was a great pleasure to work with the Foundation on this.